Welcome to the Birth Launch Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts and learn how to craft your ideal birth. We will tackle the scary and weird questions that come up along the way and provide answers that are driven by science and evidence-based recommendations. I'm going to show you how to redefine parenthood and choose what's best aligned for you and your goals. With 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I'm ready to help you navigate pregnancy and explore your birth options to free yourself of fear surrounding childbirth. My goal is to help you have an informed and confident labor experience, plus an empowered and joyous postpartum. Petra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Heck yeah, I'm so excited to have you. I sometimes go a little rogue and I love to share the stories on the outskirts and I love to share the stories that never get shared, but somehow are these stories that we need. They are these stories that people need to know to be able to truly understand their options and take control of their labors and ask the right questions and know what is available to them. So, you, my friend, have had 3 C-sections and then went on to have a VBAC, otherwise known as a VBA3C, so vaginal birth after 3 C-sections. Can you talk us through, well, I think before we get started, why don't you walk us through your C-sections? I think it would be helpful to understand where you're starting from and what were the reasons that you had 3 previous C-sections before we dive into how do we prep for a VBA3C.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, these stories deserve to be heard too, because, I still grew these humans and they were still born just a different way. So, I was actually 16 years old. So, I was a teen mom. Obviously, this was not planned, but I'm so grateful for that experience because it helped me grow up in a big way, and I was on a path that was not a great path. So, I'm so grateful for that experience. So, I was a teenager, so I did not prepare, I did not research. I just thought like, well, our bodies know how to give birth. I don't need to do anything because it'll do it. And of course, our bodies do know how to give birth. But when we're faced with being in the hospital system and we're put on these time clocks or, we have these policies or regulations pushed in our face, it's hard. It's really hard. So I had a great pregnancy. It was incredible. I was 40 weeks and 2 days, and I woke up in the morning and thought I peed myself. So I was like, okay. I just put on a pad, cleaned myself up, and went back to sleep. Woke up like a couple hours later with contractions. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm in labor. So at the time, I was living with my daughter's father and his parents. So his mom at the time was like, okay, we'll take a shower, get ready, and then we'll head to the hospital. And I was like, okay, because that's what I've seen in all the movies too. Your water breaks and you just go to the hospital. And the only thing that I had ever done while I was pregnant was also watch A Baby Story on TLC. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was like the most birth education I got.
That's like a flashback, like a major flashback. Like way back. Yes, I love that. I love that show.
Yeah, me too. I was obsessed, but it wasn't like, didn't show like the realities,
No,
of what labor and birth actually looks like.
very
Um,
dramatized.
very
Very much a
traumatized.
show.
Yes. So I was at the hospital. I don't remember what I was when I first got there, centimeter wise, but I do remember a couple hours later, they were like, okay, well, you're 4 centimeters. And I had gotten to the hospital at about, I want to say it was like 10 o'clock in the morning. And they were encouraging me to stay in the bed because the baby kept coming off of the monitors. And so they're like, no, you got to stay in bed. And so I was just felt like I was suffering in bed, turning side to side and just like, I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was wanted to just crawl out of my skin because it was terrible. And so the doctor came in a few hours later and was like, you know what? You're not progressing. and your baby has had some dips in her heart rate. I think we should go for an emergency cesarean because, your baby could die. And that's literally all I heard was your baby could die. And I was like, well, what are we waiting around here for? Like, let's do this. Like, I didn't understand what was happening. But then after that, there was no rush. Nobody was rushing around. So I was like, is this an emergency? So it was like an hour later when I finally got into like started getting prepped to go to the OR. And, it was a very slow process. And I just thought it was so weird because if it was an emergency and my baby could die, why was everybody being so slow, so casual? They were just like joking and laughing with each other. It's like, this is so weird. So we got into there and, I got all numbed up. And then all of a sudden, I was just so loopy and they had my hands tied down. So I was like in a cross shape on the bed with my hands spread out to the side. And I just felt so helpless and just it was so surreal. I was like, is this really happening right now? And it felt like a dream, like a fog, because I was so drugged up too, because the anesthesiologist gave me like extra jugs to calm me down. And so all I heard was, "Oh, here's your baby." And I didn't even see anything. It was like a blur. And then all of a sudden, they brought this baby wrapped in a bunch of blankets around where I could only see like the little circle of her face. And I was like, okay. And I couldn't hold her because I was just so drugged up. I was like shaky and just out of it. I didn't even realize what was going on. So that was my first experience with having a cesarean. And, during the cesarean, I remember the doctors were actually talking about their dinner that night. The doctor was saying, "Oh, now I'll be able to make my dinner. I'm going to get out of here right after this." And I was just like, I'm hearing all these things in the back of my mind. And I'm just like, is this really happening right now? And it was just so surreal and just like a blur after that. Yeah, it was terrible. And the postpartum recovery was terrible because now I was taking care of this newborn. I'm a teenager myself, and I'm like, they're really gonna like trust me with this baby to take care of by myself. And I just had a major abdominal surgery. I'd had never had any surgeries like before that. So it was just so weird, so weird. Such a weird experience and introduction into motherhood. So that was my first one. Then I ended up not being with my daughter's father because he was just never there. He was just in his own world. And I moved in with my mom and I ended up meeting my husband and my now husband. And it was about 10 years after my first cesarean, we got pregnant. And I ended up having a partial placenta previa at my 20-week ultrasound. So that was rough. I didn't really understand what it meant. And my doctor just said, "Well, you just have to have a scheduled C-section. That's what we do. Like we don't even do VBACs at this hospital." Because I told her I wanted a VBAC. And she's like, "No, we don't even do them at this hospital. So even if you didn't have a previa, she's like, we wouldn't do it here." And I was like, "Huh, okay." So I just felt like at such a loss. And I was like, well, I guess this is what it has to be. And I didn't realize that, as your uterus grows, that placenta grows up with your uterus. And yeah, so I found out later when I was planning for my VBAC that they did an ultrasound at 35 weeks and it was completely out of the way. I had no previa. And I ended up having a scheduled cesarean at 36 weeks because I had like literally a couple drops of blood when I wiped, which I feel like it might have been part of just like my labor stuff possibly gonna happen because I felt like I was gonna go into labor, but they freaked out and they were like, "Oh, we have to do a cesarean now. Like, we got to do at 36 weeks." So I just trusted my doctors. I come from a family of like medical professionals and people that are in the hospital system, nurses and RTs and whatnot. So I really trusted that the medical providers, had my best interest at heart. So I just went along with it. And, that was really hard. I knew kind of what to expect, but I still didn't like plan or prepare for that cesarean. Like it was still I just felt helpless, I'm laying on this bed, numbed up, and I'm not a part of the process. I remember the doctors were talking about their weekend and, while they're doing the cesarean. So it was just like I just didn't feel a part of any of the process at all. And they they showed me my baby when they pulled her out. And it's like I felt nothing. Like, of course, I love this baby. I love her. She's my child. I love her. But there was so much disconnect because I didn't feel connected to the process. And it was just, I don't know, I never cried or anything like that. So that was really hard too. They took her to the warmer, of course, did all the measurements and weights. And I told my husband, go with her. And, it was, here I was laying on this table being sewn back together. And I remember just looking at the ceiling like, this sucks. And, I just felt so disheartened and like, why is my body broken? Why can't I give birth, the way it was designed to? And so that was a hard postpartum because I didn't deal with any of my birth experiences. I just moved on into postpartum and was now trying to figure out life with two children. And so, yeah, that was a hard postpartum also because she was an early baby. So we had a really tough time breastfeeding and just healing, from a surgery. And so, fast forward a couple years, we decided to have a third child. And it was about almost 4 years after my second. And so I went, and I saw the same doctor. It's funny. I thought I'd get a different result with the same doctor. Kind of funny, but that doesn't work out well. So I went to the same doctor and she was like, well, that we don't do VBACs here. And, it's so dangerous, even more dangerous now that you've had two cesareans. And she was like, your baby could die during this process. Like, you could die, you could bleed out. Like, and she was telling me so many things, all of the negatives. She never told me that there was any benefit, anything beneficial about, a VBAC. So, I had always heard the old phrase, once a cesarean, always a cesarean. So that kept going through my mind. And then my husband was also, uneducated about birth and cesareans. And he was like, well, if the doctor says it's the right thing to do, then maybe we should do it. And I was like, yeah. And, I didn't do my research, but I also felt like I did feel at the end like my body was preparing for labor. And, I had a gut feeling that a cesarean was not the right choice, but I still went along with it anyways, just because I was scared. I had fear because of all the fear put into me. So I did end up having a scheduled cesarean at 39 weeks. There was no complications, no issues with the pregnancy or baby. I did plan for like a gentle-ish cesarean. So I wanted like to have the clear drape and I wanted my own music. I wanted no sidebar conversations during the cesarean. I wanted her immediately on my chest and, so I could feel more a part of the process at least if I thought like at the time I thought I had to have a cesarean. So they did only honor the clear drape, and that was about it. They said the anesthesiologist is the one who picks the music, so it's up to him. And I was just like, this is my birth. Why is it up to him? But he like was playing classical music, so it wasn't bad, but it just wasn't my music. Yeah, so that I still didn't feel that like connection. It was like so disconnecting from the experience and it's so cold in the OR, and I just felt like I don't know, I just felt so disconnected. And then when my husband went again with the baby, I was alone again with my thoughts. And, there's like oh my gosh, there's like a light in the ceiling where you could see the reflection. So I could see them like sewing my abdomen back together. And I was just like, this sucks. Like, oh my gosh. But that postpartum was a lot easier. And because I did plan and prepare for the postpartum because I knew how it would be. And so that was my third cesarean. And, of course, I love my children so deeply. I love them all. But I did not love the experiences that I had to bring them into this world. Just for me, it was so disconnecting and I felt so helpless. And I felt like I didn't have a choice at the time.
I think a lot of
So,
people can resonate with that. I think that your story so beautifully illustrates how the medical system puts you on an immediate conveyor belt that also turns into a long-term conveyor belt, right? In the
mhm.
immediate, you went down that classical, okay, it's failure to progress, your body's taken too long, we need an emergency C-section and try instead of trying, you know, other things, positional changes, environmental changes, giving your body time, getting you a rest, maybe getting you more comfortable. There's a ton of things that we could try, but it seems like your doctor was more concerned with getting you in and out through a C-section because they had dinner plans to get to in your first birth. Well, then that translated into your second birth, you being told, oh my gosh, well, all these very kind of normal things that would have otherwise resolved themselves made you quote unquote, oh no, high risk because on top of that, you're a VBAC. Okay, well, now we have to do a C-section. All right, well, now you have two surgeries. Well, that automatically put you as a C-section for your third, right?
Mhm.
And so you can see how in your labor itself, there is this motive to kind of put you on this conveyor belt, but it's bigger than that. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it is bigger than that. It's longer term than that. One primary C-section, if you don't know better and you don't have a good provider that's explaining these things to you and truly transparently having these conversations saying, "Hey, you don't have to have a C-section. We can VBAC." Like there's another option. But then it goes into we've got these dang hospitals that are limiting this stuff, right? They're saying, well, we're not going to do this, knowing that it's safer to have a vaginal delivery than it is to have another C section. Like, if it was really about women and children and safety and health outcomes, every hospital would be VBACing and we would be supporting and encouraging people to VBAC. But instead, we're putting them on this C section conveyor belt. What's that about, right? You
Mhm.
have to ask why. What's the motive there? What's driving this? What's in it for the hospitals? What's in it for the doctors? What's in it for the system that
Yeah.
they want me to continue to have repeat after repeat after repeat after repeat C-section, knowing that I could VBAC?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so, what actually drew me towards a VBAC after my third cesarean was because I was like, there has to be another way.
Totally.
I cannot go through another cesarean without actually diving into the information. So, we did decide to have a fourth child. And I wanted to wait because, if you look up how to have a successful VBAC, they say wait that 18 months in between. And so I waited and I calculated it. So my third would be 2 years old by the time I was giving birth to my fourth. I wanted to give myself enough time to heal from that surgery, and I also wanted to do some research. So I definitely did my research. I reached out to like my local I Can chapter, and if your audience is not familiar, it's International Cesarean Awareness Network, and they have different chapters around the world. And they have chapter leaders that have access to local resources for VBAC access. So that could be VBAC practitioners that are supportive of VBAC, or, hospitals or VBAC doulas. It just depends on the chapter leader and what information they have. So I did reach out to her and she gave me amazing resources. None of them were closer than a 2-hour range from me though. So yeah, I had reached out to all of the local hospitals and a lot of local OBs and even the local home birth midwives, because I considered a home birth, but all of them, I was too high risk because of my cesareans and I hadn't had a vaginal birth yet. So if I had had a vaginal birth, then they would have taken me on, but so it's okay though. So I didn't find anybody local, but I did change insurances because I was still with the same doctor that did my two previous cesareans. And so I told her I wanted to VBAC, and she's like, oh my gosh. No, she's like, that is so dangerous. And I was like, well, I'm going to do it. And, nobody can stop me. So that's just my
I'm doing
plan.
it anyway. We are going to VBAC. You can do it with me or you cannot.
Yeah. So, and I didn't realize like I could change insurances and I could change doctors. And so that was the plan. I knew she wasn't going to be supportive. And so that's what I did. But I didn't do that until I was pregnant. So I wasn't able to do that until I was pregnant because of where I worked at the time. So we did get pregnant immediately. And so I started on my journey. I changed insurances to our local Kaiser, so it's Kaiser Modesto, and they are supportive of VBAC after 2 C-sections. So I was like, oh, well, I just had one more than that, so they've got to be supportive of me. I have a way better chance. So I did end up changing insurances and no, they were not supportive, but they did support VBAC. They didn't have their VBAC ban like the other hospital. So I was very highly encouraged and I did so much like mental work on this journey. I had fears because of all the fears that were instilled into me over time. So I faced those fears. I went through every single fear that was coming up, the fear of uterine rupture, which is the one you always hear about, and then the fear of like even just like the pain of labor because I don't remember what it was like because at that point it had been 16 years since my last labor that I actually went through. The fear of tearing, whatever fear came up, even if it felt silly, like I still went through that fear and faced it. And I looked at, okay, what is the worst thing that could happen? And then what if that worst thing happens? What can I do? What are my options if that does happen? And, as in like for the tearing, I was thinking like, okay, what does it look like for them to repair a tear? So it didn't feel so scary to me if that did happen. So that really helped me. And I also looked at like, what is the best thing that could happen? And which a lot of that was like my mental state because I was so down on myself. I had no confidence in my body because I did feel so broken from having 3 cesareans that I felt like I had no choice in having because my body just couldn't do it. So I had to also process that and say, no, my body can do this. Like I am strong. I am not broken. And so I created like a list of affirmations and I stuck them on like sticky notes and I stuck them all over my house. I stuck them like on my bathroom mirror. So I would look at those every single day and I would do some mirror work, which it's awkward if you've never done mirror work, but I looked at myself in the mirror and I would say, "You're strong. You can do this. You are incredible." And just like so many things that helped like boost my confidence because over time we break ourselves down so much and without even realizing it. And so we have to work at building ourselves back up. So that's what I had to do. So I did that every single day. I also did like meditation and yoga, just stuff that made me feel mentally and physically good. And I wouldn't spend like hours a day on doing this. It was like maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. So it wasn't like I was taking entire chunks of my day to do this stuff. It was easily doable. So I did do that and I had such an amazing pregnancy. It was so uncomplicated. I felt so connected to my baby. I would literally talk to him every single day and be in quiet just with myself. And which that's hard when you have 3 other
Yeah.
children, but I made it work because it was important to me.
Yeah.
I really wanted to feel confident and connected to my baby. And so I did this work every single day. I researched my heart out. So at the time, I was working as an in-home like CNA, taking care of elderly adults. And so I was working graveyard shifts and I had one client at the time and he would sleep through the whole night. So I was able to research my heart out. I would literally research for like hours, like the actual statistics on uterine rupture, the success rate. And, there's not a lot of research on VBAC after 3 cesareans. So I was looking at a lot of research of VBAC after 2 cesareans. And I just like built that confidence in myself that this was the right decision because I was following my heart, I was following my gut. And so I just breezed through pregnancy until I started seeing the doctors at Kaiser because I started at like 30 weeks pregnant and I was like every single appointment I would have to tell them because they were like making me see different practitioners at every single appointment. So I would see like a nurse practitioner, I would see an OB, I would see a maternal fetal medicine doctor. They were throwing everybody at me. And they all said the same thing, your baby can die, you can die, your uterus can rupture. If you were my wife, I would not allow you to do this. like so many different things. And so I got really discouraged at some points, because it's hard when people are just spewing negativity at you and telling you that you're making the wrong choice. So I really had to hone into myself and build a support team. My husband was my number one. And then it was like my mom, my sister, my brother were all really close, and like a couple of my best friends. And they supported me no matter what. In the beginning, I started telling people I was going for a VBAC. And one family member in particular was like, that's so dangerous. You can die. Like, I've heard once a cesarean, always a cesarean. Like, maybe you should listen to your doctor. So after that point, I was like, I'm not going to tell anybody outside of my bubble. So I also did hypnobirthing. So I did that and I practiced that every day, and that really did help me hone into myself as well. And it just helped me stay calm because it's very calming. So I did that as well, and I felt so confident because I had this small bubble of community and people who were supportive of me that I knew had my back no matter what. I also followed like VBAC Facebook groups and communities and talked with other women. I searched for women who have had VBAC after 3 cesareans, and I talked to them. Like, I messaged them, we talked, and it was just, I felt so encouraged. I was like, if one person can do it, I can do it. It's been done. I can do it. And so let's get to the labor part, because this was the best part. So I was so prepared for labor. I was so excited for when it started. So I went to 39 weeks, and I want to say it was like 5 or 6 days, and I got contractions at night, and I was like, oh my gosh, labor's starting. And so it went on like every 5 minutes, then every 30 minutes, then every 5 minutes, then every 10 minutes. And that was like for a couple hours throughout that first night. And then I like was like, okay, I really got to try to rest. So I closed my eyes, woke up, and it was morning. I was like, wait, what? I'm not in labor. So I was discouraged at first, but then I was like, it's okay. Like, my body's on its own timeline. My body's just preparing for the big labor part. And so that day I just went through my day as normal, tried to rest, eat really nourishing foods, and spend time with my family. And then that night, the same thing. So labor started. I was like, oh, yes, this is so amazing. And the same thing every 5 minutes, every 30 minutes, then it piddled out. And I was like, shoot. Then I just went through the day as normal, took some nice hot baths. I got a massage. I just felt amazing, was just trying to really enjoy myself and not focus on like, when is labor going to start? And so that night, labor started again. I was like, oh, yes, this is amazing. And same thing. Every 5 minutes, every 30 minutes, every 10 minutes, contractions. And I was like, shoot. And then it stopped. And so I did like the mile circuit to try to like just relax my body. I tried to just sleep. Yeah. And then I just slept it off. And so we're coming to, this was Monday morning, and it was already a scheduled 40-week appointment with my doctor. And, I had wanted like little to no interventions. And when I got there, she was like, "Oh, can I check you?" And I was like, "Sure." And I was like 2 centimeters. And I was like, "Yes, my body is working. Like, this is amazing." And she's like, "Well, I can do a membrane sweep if you want to." And at first I was like, but then I was like, I'm so exhausted. And I was like, sure. And so she did a membrane sweep. And for me, I know not everybody, it doesn't work for everybody, but for me, it was like on. So after she did the membrane sweep, my contractions started and did not stop. And so we were in the doctor's office, and it took us 20 minutes to walk from the doctor's office to my car, when it should have taken like maybe 3 to 5 minutes, because I had crazy back labor and I needed those hip squeezes from my husband for every single contraction. And so we had to keep stopping, and I was like, all right, this is the real deal. So I like texted my doula because I hired a doula, and I was like, hey, they're like every 5 to 10 minutes now. She's like, great, like go rest and eat. And I was like, yep, that's exactly what I plan to do. So we went home. I ate like a nourishing meal, got on my birth ball. I was doing like hip circles and just like really enjoying my family time. So this was about 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. And I was just feeling so good and excited. And I started setting up my birth cave because we had already strung like fairy lights in my room because that's where I was going to labor until we headed to the hospital. I put affirmation cards all over, and I just had it set up really comfy and cozy and nice and dark because that's what I read, helps labor along, was having just that like birth cave. And so after a while, I was like, all right, I got to go in my cave because I'm too distracted by everything. And so I went in there, and I had that crazy back labor my whole entire labor. And then it was so weird. It was like deferred pain because it was like radiating throughout my inner thighs and just like the front muscles of my legs. And that was like the craziest thing I had ever felt. So being in like a hands and knees or just like bent over position was the best position for me. That's what felt best for me. So I was laboring in there, and it was like about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when I texted my doula, like, hey, I'm ready for you. And so she got there like an hour later, and it was beautiful. She brought like aromatherapy. So we had that going in the room. And she was just, amazing with her hip squeezes and, suggesting position changes. And then like at one point we got on the toilet, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this toilet is feeling something different." I started like shaking uncontrollably, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, am I cold? I don't feel cold." And she's like, "It's okay. Just give into it. You're in transition." And I was like, "Okay." And like when she said that, I just like my body melted down, and I was like, "Okay, it's okay. Like this is normal." And so I just like wrote it out, and it was so sweet. So it wasn't planned, but like my mom ended up coming over to like pick up the kids from school, and my brother ended up coming over. I don't remember why. And then my sister came over, and all my kids were there. So, typically this would sound like too many people to have, but for me, I loved it. It was perfect. I felt so much love. Everybody was hugging me and kissing me and giving me like words of affirmation. And it just felt so good. And at one point, my brother even like jumped in to give me hip squeezes. My 6-year-old daughter at the time, she jumped in to give me hip squeezes. They were not effective, but it was so sweet that I just let her do it. It was just so beautiful, and I felt so calm, and I felt no fear. I just felt confidence in myself. And so labor was like a breeze. Like we were laughing and joking and talking in between contractions. And so after I had like hit transition, I heard a couple times like, should we go to the hospital now? And by this point, it was like, I want to say 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So I had been laboring for around like 7 or 8 hours at that point, but I was definitely in transition. And so I was like, okay, let's go. So we headed to the hospital. It was like a 15-minute drive. I had to be in all fours on the way there because that was just my jam. And then my labor started to not feel as intense. I started to become more aware of my surroundings. And I was like, these are way easier to get through now. And so I know obviously that trip kind of like slowed me down a little bit just because I was out of my like safe space. But we got to the hospital, and it was also kind of annoying because like when we first got there, the security guard was like asking my husband and my doula, "Do you guys have the COVID shot?" And my doula said, "Yeah." My husband said, "No." And she's like, "Oh, well, we got to test you for COVID." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, are you serious?" I was like, "Well, how long is this going to take?" And she's like 15 or 20 minutes. I was like, 15 or 20 minutes? No way. Oh my gosh. Because I did not want him to be away from me because he said he would advocate for me if need be. And I really wanted to make sure I was supported. My doula, which I knew from the beginning, she said she was not willing to advocate for me, and I was okay with that because I knew my husband would. Not all doulas are willing to advocate, and I totally get that. It's a personal preference. So, anyways, I went up with my doula, and it took us a while. It took us like 15 minutes to get up there, anyways, because I didn't want the wheelchair. I wanted to walk, so we had to keep on stopping. So, we got into triage. I got checked. And it was a resident, I didn't realize at the time, and he was like, "Oh, yeah, you're like 9 or 10." And I was like, "Yes!" Like, "Oh, that's exactly what I wanted to hear." And because I didn't wanna get there too early because I didn't wanna be there a long time and, possibly get interventions introduced that I didn't want. So I was excited. I was like, "Yes, we're doing this." And then my husband got there, and so they, like, switched out. My husband came in and my doula went out, and then a doctor came in and was like, "All right, I gotta check you." And I was like, "I just got checked." And he's like, "Well, no, he's a resident, so I have to like check his work." And I was like, if I would have known that, I would have not like been okay with that check because I don't want double checks. And he was like, "Well, I gotta make sure." And I was just like, whatever, let's just hurry up and do it. And so he did it, and he said I was like, he's like, "Oh, you're more like 8 and 8.5." And I was like, "Really?" So that was like a little discouraging for a second. And he said like I had a bulging bag of waters, and I was like, "Okay." And he's like, "Break it if you want." And I was like, "No, I'm okay right now." And so they got us into a room, we got all like comfortable in there, and I was just laboring away, and it was like I started to get back in the groove of my labor and was able to like focus on what I was doing. And it was beautiful. We were going to the bathroom, we were changing positions, and I was not just staying in the bed. I was like very adamant I didn't just want to stay in the bed, but they did want to like monitor me, so I did allow like the continuous monitoring. And then they wanted to start an IV on me, but I asked for the port. So they did put the IV in, but it was closed and I had no fluids running into me. So, we were just laboring away. My nurse was amazing. Shout out to Britta. Britta was awesome. She was just so chill and go with the flow. And she was like with whatever I wanted to do. So that was awesome. And so it was like a little while later, I want to say like maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours later. And I was like, "Ooh, something's feeling different. Like I'm not able to get through these contractions as easily as before." I was like, "I don't know, but I kind of feel like I need a push or something." And I remember like the doctor did come in and like said, "Oh, we can break your water." And I was like, "Okay, just hurry up and do it." Cause I don't know. I was just in that mindset where I was just like, whatever. So he broke my water. And then like after that, it was really on. Like they felt more intense. And I was just not able to like really sit still anymore or get through them as easily. So at that point, I think he said I was complete, but he needed to like come down a little bit. And so I was like laboring down, and all of a sudden I was just like, I gotta push or something. And I wanted to be in hands and knees, but I don't even remember why they said no, but they were like, "No, like let's sit you in the bed." And I think it was because they couldn't get the baby's heart rate as good. I want to say that's the reason. And so I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so annoying." And so I was like sitting upright in the bed, and I was like, "Well, I got to push or something." And then so like the nurse like kind of checked, and she was like, "Oh, yeah." I'm like, "I think you're ready." And so I was like, "Okay, good, because I'm pushing." And so I was like sitting up in the bed like in a throne position, and they have like these handles next to the bed, like on the side of the bed. So I was like pulling on the handles to give me some like, I guess, traction or something. So I just felt like I needed something. And so they said, they brought the mirror and everything. And it was so funny because they're like, look in the mirror, your baby's right there." And I was just like, all I see is a fat vagina. And I will never forget that because I was like, "Oh my god." But it was like the baby was right there, but it was just like in my head. Oh my gosh, it was like too much. And they were like, "Okay, well, you're making progress or whatever." And so once I did see like the baby's head, I was like, "Oh," in my head, I was like, "Oh, it's on." So I like pushed as hard as I could, and he like flew out. So they said I pushed like 5 times before he came out. And I'm telling you, he flew out. It was like the doctor's hands and my hands were right there. And I like pulled him to my chest and I was like, oh my gosh, I just did that. And like they were saying, like, oh my gosh, you did it. Congratulations. And I was just like crying. And I was like, thanking God and just like my husband's so ridiculous. His name's Javi, but I was like, thank you, Jesus. And he's all, my name is Javi. And I was like, oh my gosh, shut up. He's always gotta be the jokester. Gotta love him though. He makes the mood light. But it was just like I was laughing, I was crying, I was in disbelief. And it was just like, wow, all that work that I did leading up to this moment. And it was just so incredible. I felt so supported by my husband, by my doula, by the staff. Like I thought I was going to have to fight for this VBAC when I got there because nobody was supportive before that. But once I got into the hospital, I didn't say this before, but in triage, that when they heard how far along I was dilation wise, they were like, "Yes, let's have a baby. Like, let's do this." And I was like, "Yes." So they were so supportive and it was incredible. And after I like gave birth, there was like so many nurses coming in congratulating me, and nurses were bringing other nurses in like, "This is the one that had a VBAC." And it was, yeah, it was so awesome. And it was actually a midwife that was at the birth, the midwife and a resident, the original resident that checked me. So I don't know. To me, I'm like, I feel like that changed that resident. Now he can see that VBAC after multiple cesareans is possible. And he can go into his practice being like, yeah, I've seen that. It is possible. And, it just felt so good, to have so many people be like, no, you cannot. And then I did. So, and, honestly, because I did plan like have a plan prepared if I did have a cesarean. And I felt okay with that. If I did have a cesarean, I felt okay with that because on this journey to my VBAC, I found my voice. I figured out that I could make my own decisions and that was okay. Whatever decision I decided to make was the right choice. It didn't matter what my doctors thought, what my family thought, what anybody thought, because it was my body, my baby, and our birth experience. So that just built so much confidence in myself, not just for the birth, but for my postpartum. Now I felt more confident speaking up for my baby, my other children, because it just instills this confidence in you that you're like, yes, I am the one that gets to make that decision. Why wouldn't I be? Right?
I think that society does a really great job of beating that out of us to make us
Mm,
not trust and believe in ourselves and not trust our bodies and not trust the process. We are almost bred to believe that we need something else. We're always being told to look outward, right? Look somewhere else for your education. Look somewhere else for your health care. Look somewhere else for your faith. Look somewhere else for your success, for your riches, for your leadership, literally anything. Very rarely are we told and taught and guided to look inward
yeah.
into whatever we already hold. Okay, so your VBAC story is just like so amazing. I know that is so empowering, and I know that I think you're right. I think that you changed everyone's life in that room, like your life, your baby's life, your husband's life, the nurses, that anesthesiologist, or the attending, the resident, everybody who was there that day. I think walked away probably with a different perspective than what they had before they had seen your birth. It would have been nice if you had had the support that you got when you showed up to the hospital during pregnancy.
Right? Yeah, seriously. But it was
Yeah.
it was just not non-existent.
Well, it makes me wonder just how much more harmonious could your pregnancy have been if you had felt supported and kind of in alignment with your healthcare providers.
Yeah, definitely, because I felt like I dreaded all of my appointments that I was going to. I just felt so much anxiety because I was like, well, I know they're going to try to talk me into cesarean. They would tell me every time, let's get your cesarean on the calendar just in case. And, all that kind of stuff. And my husband was always working, so he never was able to like come with me. And so I was always alone, and I would call him afterwards and he'd be like, you know what you're doing. If you feel like this is the right decision, then you're right. And, if I didn't have him, honestly, I felt like my headspace would have been different because I had little to no support.
Yeah, you can only stand up to people telling you that you're wrong and it's dangerous and it's negligent and it's irresponsible and it's scary and that's such a bad choice for so long before you start to kind of question your own self and be like, golly, am I putting my baby at risk? Am I the
Right.
one that's making the bad decision? Am I the one that should be fearful and I'm not? Okay, so I guess I have a question about how, and maybe this is just who Javi is as a human, but how did you get Javi on board with this? And if he is just kind of naturally a supportive person and you're like, no, he's my person, he's my husband. If I wanted it, he was gonna support me. What is your advice to people who don't have a hobby and maybe their husbands and their partners are a little bit more hesitant and skeptical of VBAC, especially VBA2C or 3C or even more?
Yeah. So Javi, he definitely is just that way. And he knows I'm very stubborn. So if I say I'm doing something, then I'm doing it. Like I set my mind to something and I don't give up. And he knows that. So he was like, whatever you decide, I'm on board. So he is that way in general. But I do feel like, because I have seen this with my own, VBAC doula clients, the husbands can be scared because they're not sure what to expect, especially if the previous birth was traumatic for them, for the husband. So I definitely suggest education. So I suggest them doing birth education together, like doing that side by side. That way, if either of them have questions, they can talk to each other because no matter what, that's going to be like your person. That's going to be your main support person. Of course, you can have a doula, but nobody knows you like your husband. Nobody knows you like your partner. And so I think that is the number one thing is just being educated on the actual risks and benefits, on the actual statistics of like uterine rupture or whatever other, complication that is being presented as a risk for having a VBAC. So definitely that education is key. And also having open lines of communication because, so much of the time the husband is kind of pushed to the side because it's the woman who's pregnant, but that is still, your partner's child too. So being included in the conversation and asking him, how does he feel about it? Does he have any fears or he or she have any fears going into this? That way those can be talked about before labor ever begins and they can be resolved either with each other or even talking to like a therapist or something to help you get through that because I know that can be such a huge hurdle especially when you have a hard time communicating with each other. So those are like the two biggest things that I suggest is just that education and talking to each other and also like the person giving birth. Like, what does she expect her partner's role to be exactly? Because that can make a difference. Because some husbands, they just don't know what to do. They want to help so bad, but they don't know what to do. So, talking about that beforehand so that there's no like miscommunication or misinterpretation. Because I'm like that. I used to be like, of course, my husband can like read my mind, right? He knows what I want and need. But no, they cannot read our minds. We have to be clear on what we want. So, I think those are the biggest things that I would suggest so that there's just like that education is so important and communication first
I
and
agree.
foremost.
Yeah, and having a partner that really is supportive versus just doing this because it's what you want. They need to also believe in VBAC. They need to believe in your ability. They need to believe in you. Don't forget that anybody in the room that's holding any fear is bringing fear into that space, right? And
Yep.
so you want to make sure that the people who are in your birth space are not bringing undue fear into your birth space, right? You want to
Yeah.
make sure that it is as free from fear as possible, and that includes your partner. So, can we talk about the importance of healing from your past birth experiences? Because you mentioned this briefly in between your C sections that you didn't really do a lot of healing, you didn't really do a lot of processing, or kind of, you know, hitting these things head on, and what had happened in your previous births, and they did impact your future births. Talk to us about that. What did you experience? What did you learn through that experience? And then what should people be doing in between their birth experiences to prep for the next one?
Yeah, so I did not process my previous birth experience from my first to my second to my third until I was getting ready for my fourth. So, the time frame between my first and my fourth was 16 years. So, I had to really dig deep and just process those experiences. And what that looked like for me was I took a notepad and I literally wrote down every single thing that I remembered from the way I felt, the way I felt, the way people were treating me, how the room looked, how the room smelled, if I could remember that. And just like wrote down also after that, how do I wish I felt? How did I wish people treated me? How do I wish the room looked or felt or smelt? That for me right there was the biggest starting point because it brought up so much emotion that I wasn't expecting. I was literally sitting there bawling my eyes out because I didn't realize how deeply negative that impacted me, how deeply emotional that impacted me. And it made me feel so many feelings, like I said, it made me feel like helpless. It made me feel not a part of the process. It just made me feel like not an active participant and everything was being done to me. And that is just one of the hardest feelings to go through for me, anyways. So that's what that looked like for me. Personally, I didn't reach out to a therapist. I didn't feel the need to because I felt already such a weight lifted off of my chest. I didn't realize how heavy my chest felt from, having these experiences and not processing through them. And it's hard. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not easy. It is very hard. It's hard to go through those deep emotions. But for me, it was so worth it because I was able to face that and turn it around. So from facing those emotions, I was then able to write down, how do I want to be treated in my labor and birth? How do I want the room to look? How do I want it to smell? Who do I want there? And I would vividly imagine that, what it would look like and smell like. And I'm telling you, that's exactly how it happened. The way I envisioned it is exactly how it happened, down to like me bringing my baby up, looking at him and putting him on my chest. Like, it is so transformational because it helped me, like I told you before, find my voice that I didn't realize was lost. I did not realize that. I didn't realize that I was just going along for the ride and just doing what everybody told me to do until I did that. So, sometimes it's so deep and so hard depending on what you went through that a therapist is necessary to help you process through that because some of these emotions are deep, deep emotions, some even stemming from childhood.
I was
Because,
just gonna say the same thing. Some of them are way deeper than just your birth experience.
yeah, because and I found that too. I didn't realize that in my childhood, I felt like I didn't have a voice or a choice so much of the time growing up. And that just translated into my adulthood and just listening to that, that high authority or what I perceive to be a higher authority than me. So yeah, there's a lot of healing there and like facing your inner child.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the past trauma, whether we're aware of it or we're not, is going to come up in labor regardless. And so you might as well face it. You might as well process it. You might as well heal it because it's not going away until you do. And just
Exactly.
like you point out is, you know, you were 4 births in before you said, "All right, let's do this thing." And
Yeah.
all of your births previously were just compounded. They had just kinda stacked on top of each other. So Go ahead and do the healing, you guys. All right. Another thing that you talked about that I think a lot of people glaze over and or they maybe question, is it worth it? It's changing doctors and you changed insurances even. Talk us through that process a little bit, not necessarily the exact process, but what did that look like for you? Like what did it look like to change doctors and how did you think to yourself, you know what, I'll just change insurances to find the care that I want. I feel like a lot of people A either don't think about that or B if they do, it feels very overwhelming. So,
Mhm.
what inspired you to actually take that action and do it?
Yeah. So when I talked about I reached out to the my local ICANN chapter leader. So she did give me like other doctors that were supportive of VBAC after one cesarean that were actually in my area. So from that list, what I did was I checked with them and I literally like got on the phone and called them and was like, what insurance do you take? So that's what I did. I called them and asked what insurance they took. At the time with my job, I had 2 options, which was the one that I had, and then I had the option of Kaiser. Obviously, depending on where you live, there could be where you pay for, an outside insurance through the state or whatever. So yeah, that's what I did. I called around and figured out which insurance would take me that had VBAC supportive practitioners on board. So once I found that most of the doctors were in the Kaiser network, I was like, all right, Kaiser, I'm coming to you. And so I, went through that process of calling Kaiser, asked them like what I can do to get on their insurance. And they literally told me every single step, like how I can enroll into that insurance. And then I just canceled my other insurance once they took me on. But it was a lengthy process for me. I didn't get onto that insurance until I was about 30 weeks pregnant. So yeah, absolutely. If you don't have a supportive practitioner and there's not one in your network, your insurance network, reach out immediately to your community to see who is a VBAC supportive provider in the area. That way you can, hey, get that insurance if possible. So that's what I did. And yeah, it was a very, very simple process for me. And it was worth it. Absolutely worth it for me.
Yeah, that was gonna be my question, and, like, I guess you have no regrets because you were able to have your VBAC, right?
Right. Yeah. And I have had like a doula client who was a VBAC after one cesarean. And she actually ended up having a VBAC at that hospital that I
Nice.
was at that had a VBAC ban. Yeah. And they were like super supportive, but she had only had one cesarean at that point. So that could make a difference too. The more cesareans you have, a lot of times the pushier they are towards one direction, which is a repeat cesarean.
Sure. So, what about the doctors? And I guess what are our options? How do you set your doula clients through when they encounter a provider that only presents the risk and the cons and the negatives of a VBAC versus transparently talking about the benefits and the risk and the pros and the cons and
Mhm.
the negatives and the positives and you know the benefits and the risk of a C-section as well. You can't really have a conversation about VBAC without talking about both vaginal and cesarean birth.
Yeah, exactly. So, what I highly suggest is obviously doing your own research. But when you are going to your practitioner's office and you're talking to them and they give you a statistic, like which I was thrown this statistic, you have a 50% chance of uterine rupture. And I was like, oh, what? Ask questions. Ask them, where did you get that information so I can find that myself? Because I really, want to know the information on it and the risks and the benefits. And if they're not presenting that information to you, I would personally take that as a huge red flag and, figure out how I can change doctors because if they're not going to present you with the risks and benefits of a VBAC and a cesarean, because there's risks and benefits to both. So, and it's dependent on what you are most comfortable with. With what risk are you most comfortable taking on? Because there's risks to both, like I said. But yeah, if they're not going to present you with both sides, huge red flag in my opinion. Like, nobody ever told me that the more cesareans I have, I am at more risk for developing placenta accreta or, just other types of things that are kind of hard on your body or complications in future pregnancies.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the conversation that we had earlier of a cesarean is much more than just a one-time thing. There are so many lifelong implications from it that we have to consider that I think a lot of providers don't honor that conversation with patients and clients before they try and convince or diagnose someone with having a C-section, right? It's a much deeper conversation than just, oh no, we think you need a C-section and we should do that. We really have to consider the things that it's going to mean for your future too.
Yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong, okay? I feel like cesareans do have a place.
Oh,
Like
definitely.
if there's actually like a medical implication for a cesarean that is worth taking on those risks, then absolutely. But when you're not presented with all the facts and, information that you should be, I don't know, to me that's just like why?
I mean, I even support non-medically necessary chosen elective inductions, right? We have people who
Yeah.
choose it because that's what they want. And I don't have to want that for myself to understand that you want that for you and support you in that. And I think a lot of providers actually I think they struggle with that. I think they really struggle with the idea of, but I think this is best for you and I'm the doctor and they often conflate that with or they're not able to separate that from the idea of yes, and this patient knows their body best and they know what they want and they know the option that feels most aligned to them and they don't owe you they don't owe you anything, an apology, a
Yeah.
explanation, anything.
Exactly. And I should also say, like, even if it, like you said, is not medically necessary, because I have interviewed on my own podcast a woman who she had a very traumatic vaginal birth and she opted for an elective cesarean for her second. And it was so healing for her. So, the opposite can happen. It's all on you. It's your choice. As long as it's like your choice, I feel like that is the best decision, no matter what it looks like.
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's where a lot of the trauma comes from, right? That's how we avoid the trauma is we allow people to choose what's best for them and honor that as long as it's a safe and reasonable option. Like the people that have healing C-sections is because they chose that. They weren't forced into it. They weren't manipulated into it. They weren't bullied or feared into it. They had a supportive system saying like, "Yeah, we totally support you if this is what you want to do. Like, here's how you can make it the best experience for you. Here's how you can make healing easier. Here are the things that you can control in your C-section so that you can make it the experience that you have envisioned." And I think that's the important part. Okay, so we've done a lot of talking about the risk and understanding the real risk and doing your own research. So, Petra, through your research, what did you find to be the real risk? And I understand that the information of VBA3C out there is very shallow. We rely a lot on the VBACs after 2 C-section information, but when it comes to real risk of VBA3C or someone who's considering a vaginal birth after having 3 C-sections, what do we need to be thinking of and considering and talking to our provider about?
Yeah, so definitely talking to your provider about what they know to be true about the risks and benefits of multiple cesareans. Because yes, after having multiple cesareans, there is more risk. I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat it. There can be more risks, like the risk of uterine rupture. It goes from less than 1% after one cesarean to, it could be a couple more percent up than that. There's no for sure evidence yet. They are working on it. There's very small studies, but I'm not comfortable stating those studies just because they're so small. But yeah, there is an increased risk, not by much. It's not like a crazy 50% amount at all. Like, so far the studies are just a couple percent. So who knows, that could be 5% or less. I don't want to put misinformation out there, but that is like the biggest concern that they always tell you. But, with more cesareans, there is more risk for like scar adhesions. There is more risk for organ damage during the cesarean. And, those can result in more surgeries. So just being confident in your own decision and doing your own research on top of talking to a trusted healthcare professional, because I don't feel like all doctors are just out there to tell you what to do. I feel like there are doctors out there that really do want to help you make a decision that feels right to you. And, I don't want to paint a bad picture of doctors because they're not. They're just not. They're doing the best that they can. And just not all doctors are comfortable with taking on that risk, which I totally get. And, it could be from previous experiences that they've had. They could have experienced a catastrophic uterine rupture and that scared them. So they don't want to do VBAC anymore. And I do also want to emphasize the fact that we talk about uterine rupture so much. And, when I think of a rupture, I imagine like your uterus is exploding, but it doesn't always happen so catastrophically. They don't really differentiate between a uterine dehiscence, which is when the scar is like slowly separating and it might not even be like your actual uterus because there's multiple layers around surrounding the uterus. So it could be just it's slightly opening. It's not like completely open, but so far there's no solid evidence on that because they just call everything like a uterine rupture. So I do want you to realize, your audience to realize, like, even if you do have a uterine rupture, I've seen women who have actually given birth vaginally with a uterine dehiscence. So it is still possible to happen. But like I said, just do your own research, do some fear clearing. If you're holding on to any fears, process that previous birth experience because that can be the biggest hindrance when it comes to your labor because like you said, those are going to show up so big in your labor if you're holding on to any of those fears or previous experiences. Like, say you had a stall in labor in your first labor, and your second later labor, they're saying, "Oh, you're stalling." Boom, you're getting like a flashback to that first labor, and then your labor completely stops because now you're feeling fear. Now you're feeling like you're not safe, and so many other things. So just doing all that work yourself and not solely relying on what your doctor says because there's so much more research that is coming out in for VBAC. Yeah, and even like home birth after cesarean. There's more research coming out about it being positive. So, yeah, I say just do your own research.
We've had a number of HBAC clients, both here in Massachusetts and also kind of across the nation. We've even done a couple of travel HBACs, so home birth after cesarean for listeners. Okay, so Petra, if I say this statement, just because your hospital has a VBAC ban doesn't mean you can't VBAC. Do you think that statement is true or false?
So, like I said, I had a client who went to a VBAC ban hospital and had a VBAC.
Well, you
So,
did it. You had a VBAC at a hospital that had a VBAC ban.
well, I mean, they did support VBACs, but it was, not VBAC after 3 cesareans.
Sure.
But yes, I mean, if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, yeah. So it's definitely not true. Like if they have a VBAC ban, you can absolutely give birth there because they cannot deny you if you're in labor and you want to labor and give birth in that hospital. That is illegal. I don't want to speak for all states, but I know here in California, they cannot turn you away
Yeah.
if you
That
want
is
to
a
give birth there.
that's a national act that they cannot turn you away.
Yeah.
The MPAW
So
Act.
So you can absolutely do that. But I think it's very important to make sure that you have a support system with you that is willing to advocate for you if need be, because it can be hard to go against a hospital system, staff, especially if they're coming into your room all the time, like, no, you need a C-section, you need a C-section. It's hard. But also, I did interview this mom who had a vaginal birth after 3 cesareans at a hospital at a Kaiser a couple hours away from me and they did not want her to. The whole time they were telling her, no, this is dangerous. Let's go get you in the OR. And she said, no, 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 no. Her husband advocated for her. She had her baby a couple of hours later in that hospital. That was negative. And even the doctor said, I'm not going to deliver your baby. And she's like, okay, that's fine. Don't. So it is definitely possible. It might not be very easy depending on who's the doctor on call, who's the nurses on call, because it really does depend on that. And sometimes if a nurse or a doctor's having a bad day, unfortunately, they might take it out on you, which sucks and is not right, but I've seen it happen time and time again.
Same. Yeah. I mean, doctors are human too, but
Mhm.
you can see how you have a lot of power in your story if you know the right questions to ask, if you know the data and where to find it, if you understand how to interpret it and then apply it to your life, your situation, your birth, to your prenatals, to the conversations that you're having with your provider. Oh my gosh, Petra, you are so inspiring on so many levels. I want to hear a little bit more about your doula support for clients who are seeking VBACs. And you also have a podcast. And also, if people are interested in connecting with you, learning more from you, working with you, how can they do all of the above?
Yeah, definitely. So I love VBAC. Obviously, I'm like super obsessed with it. And I have had quite a few VBAC clients in person. So if you're in like the Central Valley of California, I do support in-person clients in birth and postpartum. And also I support virtually too. So I do like birth processing and birth coaching. And the way that you can get a hold of me is just by like going to my website. You can go to birthingcometrue.com and there is, some buttons on there where you can get a hold of me directly or email me at petra@birthingcometrue.com. I'm also on Instagram. I love DMs. I get them all the time and it's so inspiring to me. So my Instagram is at birthingcometrue. And I just love to be able to support clients in a way that I wish I had been supported from the beginning. Yeah, and I also created like this free guide. It's like the first steps to take if you're planning a VBAC, and that's at birthingcometrue.com/VBAC guide. I just want to provide the VBAC hopeful community with as much information as I can give them because I feel like if you want a VBAC, you should be able to have it, and it's not always just about the VBAC. Because for me, it was about the journey. It was about the journey to get towards that VBAC because I felt fine if I had a cesarean or a vaginal birth at that point, because I had done all that work and I felt so confident in myself at that point and spoke up for myself. So definitely send me a DM. I seriously love to chat. Like, I'm a real person. I'm a real mom. Like, I just want to help spread all the information that I can and help you on your journey if I can, which I'm also creating like a VBAC birth education course. It's still in the works, but I really want to serve and support moms that are not just in my local area, but like all over the world. Yes.
I love that. I love that. All right, you guys, if you are hoping to have a VBAC or you're looking for more evidence-based VBAC information, seek out Petra. Go find her at Birthing Come True, and you can check out her free resources, her podcast, the VBAC Junkie Podcast, right?
Oh yeah, I didn't mention that. It's the VBAC Junkie Podcast.
Nice. On any of your streaming platforms, go grab her free guide and then connect with most of us on Instagram. All right, you guys, I will see you next episode. Until then, bye. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on the Birth Lounge podcast. Until then, head over to Instagram and find us at Tranquility by HeHe and give us a follow. You can also check us out at thebirthlounge.com.